You just cost me 30 seconds, and you don't even speak proper English, Richard Coleman said, his voice slicing clean through the low hum of crystal glasses and quiet negotiations. And just like that, the entire private dining room froze as if someone had turned the air to glass, because this wasn't just dinner. This was a $50 million deal unfolding 30 floors above Manhattan, under warm amber lights that made everything look expensive and untouchable, except Naomi Brooks, standing therein. A pressed black uniform, a tray balanced steady in her hands, invisible to most, until now. Until him. Until that sentence, the kind that wasn't meant to be heard, only felt, the kind that reminded people exactly where they stood in a room like this, or where they were supposed to stand, and a few of the investors chuckled softly, not because it was funny, but because power had just spoken and they knew better than to interrupt it, and Richard leaned back in his chair like a man who had never been questioned, never been corrected, his tailored suit perfect, his confidence sharper than the cut of his glass, because to him, people were roles, and hers was simple, serve, smile, disappear, but Naomi didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't apologize, her eyes drifting, not to him, but to the contract resting near his hand, pages slightly bent, a corner marked, numbers lined in tight precision, the kind of numbers that built empires or erased them, and for a brief second, something shifted, not in the room, but in her, a quiet recognition, a detail out of place, a number that didn't belong, and she inhaled slowly, steady, controlled, the way you do when you're about to step into something that cannot be undone, because Naomi Brooks wasn't just a waitress working a late shift for extra tips. She was someone who had spent nights studying balance sheets under dim kitchen lights, someone who knew the language of money even when no one expected her to speak it. And still, she said, nothing, not yet, because moments like this were delicate, fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. And across the table, one of the investors leaned forward, tapping his pen lightly, eyes narrowing at the silence that had stretched just a second too long, and Richard noticed it too, his jaw tightening just slightly, irritation creeping in where control used to sit, because silence, when it didn't belong to him, made him uncomfortable, and that was the first crack, small, almost invisible, but real, and Naomi saw it, just as clearly as she saw the number on page 14, just as clearly as she understood what it meant, and in that quiet, suspended moment, before anyone could speak, before the deal could move forward, before power could reassert itself, she made a decision that would change everything. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not look around for approval. She simply placed the wine bottle down with a soft, deliberate click against the polished table and leaned just slightly closer, her eyes still on the contract as if the room no longer existed. And then she spoke, calm and measured. Page 14, Section 3, the projected revenue multiplier does not match the disclosed liability structure. And for a moment no one reacted, because the sentence did not sound like defiance. It sounded like precision, like something that belonged in the room far more than she did. And that was what made it dangerous. One of the investors frowned, reaching for the document, flipping pages faster than before, the soft rustle of paper suddenly louder than the music playing somewhere in the background. And Richard let out a short laugh. Forced, sharp, the kind meant to regain control. That is not your concern, he said. But his tone had shifted, just slightly, just enough for those who were paying attention to notice. And Naomi did not respond to him. Not directly. She only added, if the multiplier is inflated, then the valuation is not just inaccurate, it is non-compliant. And that word landed differently, heavier, like a weight dropped into still water, non-compliant, legal, serious, the kind of word that made men in expensive suits sit up straighter and across the table. The lead investor adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing as he scanned the numbers again, slower. This time, more carefully, while another partner leaned over his shoulder, whispering something under his breath, and suddenly the rhythm of the room changed. The quiet confidence that had filled it just minutes ago now replaced with something tighter, something uncertain, and Richard felt it, the shift slipping through his fingers, the conversation no longer orbiting him. And that was when irritation turned into something else, something closer to urgency. We have already reviewed those figures, he said, louder now, firmer, but the authority in his voice was beginning to fracture. because no one was looking at him anymore. They were looking at the paper, at the numbers, at the possibility that something had been missed, and Naomi stepped back, returning to her position as if she had said nothing at all, as if she had not just redirected the entire room with a single observation. Her expression neutral, composed, but her eyes still aware, still watching, because she understood something Richard did not, that once doubt enters a deal, it does not leave quietly, it grows, it spreads, it rewrites everything. And across the table, the lead investor finally spoke, slow, deliberate. Can someone explain why this liability is not reflected in the final valuation? And that was it. The moment the balance tipped, the moment control changed hands, not with a shout, not with a confrontation, but with a question that should not have existed. And Richard opened his mouth to answer, but for the first time that night, he did not have the room, and for the first time in a long time, he did not have the answer. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the table like a tension no one could ignore, and the lead investor's question lingered in the air, heavy and precise, waiting for an answer that should have been simple, but was not, and Richard felt every second of it, every pair of eyes no longer admiring him but measuring him. And for a man who built his reputation on certainty, that shift was dangerous. It is a timing difference, he said finally, his voice controlled but tighter than before, a standard adjustment in projections. But even as he spoke, one of the junior analysts at the far end was already scrolling through a tablet, fingers moving faster, cross-checking numbers, verifying what had just been exposed. And then came the pause, small, almost invisible, but devastating, because hesitation in a room like this was louder than any accusation. And the analyst leaned toward the lead investor, whispering just enough for the table to feel it without hearing it. And the investor's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, his posture straightening, his tone sharpening. This is not a timing issue, he said, eyes locked on the page. This is a discrepancy. And that word landed harder than anything before it, because discrepancy meant risk, and risk meant hesitation, and hesitation meant the deal was no longer moving forward, and Richard knew it. He felt it unraveling in real time. The control he had walked in with slipping, piece by piece, replaced by doubt that he could not command away. We can clarify that, he said quickly, leaning forward now, no longer relaxed, no longer untouchable. It does not affect the core valuation. But across from him, the lead investor closed the folder halfway, not fully, but enough to signal distance, enough to slow everything down. And in high-stakes rooms, slowing down was the beginning of the end, because momentum was everything. And once it was gone, it rarely came back. And around the table, conversations began in low tones, side glances exchanged, calculations no longer about profit, but about exposure, about what had been missed, about who had missed it. And Naomi stood just outside the circle of power again, exactly where she had started, invisible, except now she was not. Now she was the reason the room had changed, the reason the numbers were being questioned, the reason a $50 million decision was no longer certain, and she did not smile, did not react, because this was never about proving someone wrong. It was about letting the truth exist long enough for others to see it. And across the table, Richard's jaw tightened as he realized something far more unsettling than the potential loss of the deal, something he had not accounted for, something he could not control, that the person he dismissed as irrelevant had just become the most credible voice in the room. And worse, she had done it without raising her voice, without asking for permission, without playing by any of the rules he understood. And as the lead investor slowly pushed his chair back, just an inch, just enough to create space, the kind of space that signaled reconsideration, Richard understood that this was no longer a negotiation, it was an unraveling, and it had started with one sentence he never thought mattered. No one said it out loud, but the deal was already bleeding, slowly, quietly, in the way only high-stakes negotiations do when trust begins to crack, and the room that once felt controlled now felt fragile, like something built on numbers that no longer held. And the lead investor did not rush, he never did. Men like him did not react, they recalculated, and he flipped the page back again, slower this time, tracing the line Naomi had pointed out, his finger pausing on the exact figure, as if confirming that it was real, that it had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. and across from him, Richard tried to recover ground. "We can revise the model," he said, his tone measured but urgent beneath the surface. "This does not change the long-term outlook." But the words no longer carried the same weight, because confidence without certainty was just noise, and the investor looked up, not at Richard, but past him, toward the legal advisor seated beside him. A subtle shift, but in rooms like this, direction mattered, attention mattered, and Richard had just lost both, and the advisor leaned in, speaking quietly but firmly. "If this liability is not properly disclosed, it creates exposure," and that word spread across the table like a shadow. Exposure, not profit, not growth, not opportunity, but risk, and once risk entered the conversation, everything else stepped back, and one of the partners closed his notebook completely, not halfway, not casually, but decisively, the kind of movement that signaled disengagement without a single word, and Naomi saw it. She saw all of it, the micro shifts, the body language, the unraveling of something that had looked unshakable just minutes ago, and she remained still, her presence quiet but undeniable now, because even though she had stepped back, her words had not. They were still sitting on the table, still being examined, still changing the outcome, and Richard felt the distance growing, not physical, but something deeper, the kind of distance that meant the room was no longer his. And for a man who built everything on control, that realization was heavier than any financial loss. "We are prepared to address any concerns immediately," he said, leaning forward again, trying to pull the conversation back. But the lead investor finally closed the folder, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a calm finality that said more than any rejection could. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, almost neutral. "We will need to pause here." And that was it. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a decision delivered with precision. The kind that ended things without needing to explain them. And around the table, chairs shifted slightly, not leaving yet, but no longer anchored, and the energy that once pushed the deal forward was gone, replaced by distance, by caution, by silence. And Richard sat there, still, composed on the outside, but inside something had shifted, something irreversible, because this was not just a delay, it was doubt. And doubt in a room like this was a verdict waiting to be finalized. And across the room, Naomi turned slightly, ready to move again, to return to the quiet rhythm of service. But before she could take a step, she felt it, the weight of attention, not dismissive this time, not invisible, but intentional. And when she looked up, the lead investor was watching her, not as a waitress, not as background, but as someone who had just changed the course of a $50 million decision with nothing more than a single sentence. The room did not empty, but it changed. Conversations no longer centered around opportunity but around caution, voices lower now, sharper, as if every word carried weight it did not have before, and the lead investor kept his gaze on Naomi for a moment longer before speaking, not loudly, not to the room, but directly to her. "What did you see?" And it was not a question asked lightly. It was the kind that bypassed titles, bypassed roles, and went straight to value. And Naomi paused, not out of fear, but out of precision, because she understood that in this moment, every word mattered more than ever, and she stepped closer, just enough to be heard without interrupting the fragile balance of the table. "The liability was structured to appear deferred," she said calmly. "But the multiplier assumes immediate recognition of revenue that is not yet secured." And again, silence followed, not confused this time, but focused, the kind of silence that listens, that processes, that recalculates in real time. And the legal advisor nodded slowly, almost reluctantly, confirming what had already begun to settle into the room. And one of the partners leaned back, exhaling through his nose, the decision forming before it was spoken, while Richard sat still, his expression controlled, but his eyes no longer steady. Because this was no longer about interpretation, it was about credibility, and credibility, once questioned, did not return easily. "Why was this not disclosed clearly?" the investor asked, this time to Richard. But the tone had changed, no longer collaborative, no longer open. It was measured, distant, and that distance said everything. And Richard opened his mouth, searching for ground that no longer existed. "It is standard practice," he replied. But even he could hear it, the weakness in the explanation, the lack of certainty. And across the table, the investor closed the folder completely now, not halfway, not loosely, but with intention, the kind that ended conversations before they could be saved, and chairs shifted again, this time more decisively. A partner checking his watch, another gathering his notes, subtle movements that carried finality without needing announcement, and Naomi stepped back once more, returning to the edge of the room where she belonged, or where she had always been expected to belong. But nothing about her presence felt small anymore, because the room had already adjusted to her, already acknowledged her in a way that could not be undone, and Richard felt it, the shift that no amount of authority could reverse, because this was not about dominance, it was about truth, and truth did not negotiate, it revealed, and in revealing, it changed everything. And as the lead investor stood slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, just certain, he gave a final glance toward Naomi, a look that held recognition, not gratitude, not yet, but something close, something that understood exactly what had just happened, and then he turned away, signaling without words that the deal, the control, the certainty that had filled the room at the start of the night, was no longer his to give, and Richard remained seated, hands still on the table, posture intact, but the illusion of control gone, because in less than a minute, without raising her voice, without asking for attention, Naomi Brooks had done what no one else in that room had managed to do. She had made power stop and listen. The room did not collapse all at once. It unraveled in layers, quiet conversations turning into decisions, decisions turning into distance, and distance turning into something final. And within minutes, the chairs that once leaned forward with interest now shifted back with caution. One investor excusing himself with a polite nod, another closing his folder with a soft but decisive snap, the kind that did not ask permission. And the momentum that had filled the night just an hour ago was gone, replaced by something colder, something calculated, and Richard watched it happen in real time. Every movement, every glance that no longer included him, every second that confirmed what he had already begun to understand, that this was not a delay, it was a loss, and not just of money, but of position, of trust, of the authority he had built his identity on, and yet he remained still, because men like him did not react in public. They contained, they controlled, even when control was slipping away. But across the room, Naomi had already returned to motion, lifting a glass, adjusting a setting, stepping seamlessly back into the rhythm of service, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had not just shifted the trajectory of a $50 million decision with a single observation. And that contrast was impossible to ignore. The man who once owned the room now sitting in silence, and the woman who had been invisible moving through it with quiet certainty. And one of the investors paused near the exit, turning back just slightly, not toward Richard, but toward Naomi, his expression thoughtful, measured, as if reassessing something he had not considered before. And that was when it became clear, the shift was not temporary, it was permanent, because value had been redefined in that moment, not by title, not by wealth, but by clarity, by truth, and by the ability to see what others had overlooked. And Richard felt that realization settle in, heavier than any number, heavier than any contract, because for the first time in a long time, he was no longer the most important person in the room, and he knew exactly when it had changed, not when the investors stood, not when the folders closed, but the second Naomi spoke, the second she chose not to stay silent. And as the last of the partners gathered their things, leaving behind a table that no longer held power but consequence, Richard finally moved, slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on the edge of the contract that had once represented certainty, now nothing more than paper, and he looked up, not at the investors, not at the door, but at Naomi, standing just a few feet away, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not apology, not yet, but recognition, because in that single night, in that single exchange, the balance of power had not just shifted, it had been rewritten, and neither of them could undo it. The room was quieter now, not the elegant quiet of wealth and control, but the kind that lingers after something important has ended, and Richard remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his hand still resting on the edge of the contract, as if holding on to something that no longer existed. And across the floor, Naomi moved with the same steady rhythm, collecting glasses, adjusting linens, her presence calm, untouched by the tension that still hung in the air, and that contrast unsettled him more than the loss itself, because she had already moved on while he was still standing in the ruins of a moment he thought he controlled. And finally, he stood, slowly, straightening his jacket out of habit, not necessity, and walked toward her, each step measured, deliberate, the way a man walks when he is not sure what he is about to say, but knows he has to say something. And Naomi noticed him before he spoke, not because he called her name, but because rooms like this taught you to feel attention before it was given. And she turned slightly, meeting his gaze with the same calm that had never left her. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, because this was not a moment either of them had rehearsed, and Richard broke the silence first, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried before. "You knew," he said, not accusing, not impressed, just stating what had become undeniable. And Naomi did not rush to answer. She simply nodded once. "I noticed," she replied, her tone even, unembellished, and that simplicity landed harder than anything else, because she was not claiming victory, not demanding recognition. She was stating a fact, and Richard exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when certainty leaves and something more complicated takes its place. "That was not your role," he said, almost out of instinct, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt outdated, disconnected from what had just happened, and Naomi's expression did not change, but her eyes held steady. "No," she said quietly, but it was still there, and that was it. No challenge, no confrontation, just truth. And for a moment, Richard had no response, because in a world where everything was negotiated, where every word carried strategy, she had offered something he was not used to dealing with, something that did not bend. And around them, the staff continued moving, the room resetting itself as if preparing for the next group, the next conversation, the next illusion of control. But this moment lingered, suspended between them, and Richard looked at her again, not as a waitress, not as background, but as someone who had seen something he had not, and more importantly, someone who had chosen to say it. And that choice, that simple decision, had rewritten everything. And for the first time that night, his voice carried something unfamiliar, not authority, not dominance, but something closer to acknowledgement. "You changed the outcome," he said, and Naomi held his gaze for a second longer before replying. Calm as ever. "No," she said. "The numbers did." And then she turned, stepping away, returning to the quiet flow of a world that would keep moving long after the deal was forgotten, leaving Richard standing there, not defeated, not broken, but changed, because for the first time, he had been forced to see something he could not control, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The night did not end with applause or confrontation. It ended with quiet departures and unfinished conversations. And within an hour the private dining room looked almost untouched, the table reset, the lights unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But for those who had been there, everything had shifted, and Richard remained longer than anyone else, standing near the window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath him, lights flickering like reminders of how many deals, how many decisions, how many moments like this had passed through his hands without resistance, until tonight. And behind him, the soft rhythm of service continued, plates replaced, glasses polished, voices low and professional. And somewhere within that movement was Naomi, no longer the center of attention, no longer the focus of the room, just another figure in motion, and yet impossible to ignore, not because she demanded it, but because something about her presence had changed. Or maybe it was not her that had changed, maybe it was the way the room now saw her. And Richard turned slightly, his gaze finding her. Again, not out of habit, but out of something closer to understanding. And for a moment, he did not approach, he did not speak, he simply watched, observing the way she moved, the way she carried herself without hesitation, without the need to prove anything. And it struck him, not as a realization that arrived suddenly, but as one that settled slowly. That power was not always loud, not always visible. Sometimes it was quiet, precise, waiting for the exact moment it needed to exist, and that was what he had missed, not the number, not the clause, but the presence of someone who saw what he overlooked, and that oversight had cost him more than a deal. It had exposed something deeper, something harder to repair, and as Naomi approached the table one last time, clearing the final glass, she paused briefly, not for him, not for anyone, just long enough to ensure everything was in place, and then she turned to leave, but this time, Richard spoke again, not with authority, not with expectation, but with something unfamiliar. "Why did you say it?" he asked, and his voice did not carry across the room. It stayed between them, contained, almost careful, and Naomi stopped, not immediately, but after a step, turning back just enough to meet his eyes, and for a second, the city outside seemed quieter, the room smaller, the moment more defined, and she answered the same way she had all night, without excess, without performance, because it was there, she said, and there was no more to add, no explanation, no justification, just a truth that did not need to be defended, and Richard nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in defeat, but in recognition, because for the first time, he understood something that could not be negotiated, that truth did not wait for permission, and as Naomi walked away, disappearing back into the rhythm of a world that had always underestimated her, Richard remained where he was, looking out at a city that had not changed, but feeling as though he had, because the room he once controlled had taught him something he could not unlearn, that power without awareness was fragile, and that sometimes the quietest voice in the room was the one that changed everything. The night closed the way most nights do in places like this, quietly, without ceremony, the last guests gone, the final glasses cleared, the city still glowing beyond the glass as if nothing had shifted at all, but inside, something had, something that would not reset with the table, something that would not disappear with the next reservation, and Richard stood there a moment longer before finally turning away from the skyline, his reflection fading in the window as he stepped back into a room that no longer belonged to him in the way it had before, and across the floor, Naomi finished her shift the same way she always did, steady, precise, checking each detail, each surface, not because anyone would notice, but because she would, and when she finally untied her apron, folding it neatly, there was no pause, no moment of triumph, just a quiet completion of the night, and as she moved toward the service exit, the manager approached her, not hurried, not casual, but with a tone that carried something new, something careful. "The investors asked about you," he said, and Naomi did not react immediately, not out of surprise, but out of habit, because attention had never been something she relied on, and she simply nodded once, acknowledging the information without chasing it, without holding on to it, because she understood something most people in that room did not. That recognition was temporary, but value was not, and behind her, Richard watched from a distance, not approaching this time, not interrupting, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been revealed, and for the first time in a long time, he did not try to control the ending. He let it stand as it was, unfinished, unresolved, real, and as Naomi stepped through the door, leaving the polished floors and controlled lights behind, the noise of the city greeted her, louder, freer, unfiltered, and she walked into it without hesitation, without looking back, because she did not need to, not tonight, not after what had already been done, and inside, Richard remained still for a moment longer, the weight of the night settling in, not as a loss to be recovered, but as a lesson that could not be ignored, because numbers could be rewritten, deals could be rebuilt, but awareness, once forced into view, stayed, and as the lights dimmed slightly, and the room prepared for another night, another table, another version of control, one thing remained unchanged, something no contract could contain, no title could define, that the quietest voice in the room had spoken, and everything had followed, and somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the lights, beyond the reach of power, Naomi Brooks kept walking, not because she had won, not because she had proved anything, but because she had seen the truth, and she had chosen not to stay silent. And that was something no one in that room could take back.